My name is Francesca Hale. I am 61 years old. I was once a commander in the United States Marine Corps. For over 3 decades, I wore the uniform with pride, served my country with every breath, and carried both medals and scars as reminders of battles won and battles survived. But no one tells you that the hardest battle doesn't happen overseas. It happens when you come home, when the war is over, but the world has already moved on without you. I wasn't always the hollowed-out shell you see today. I used to command respect-lead soldiers into the fire and come out the other side breathing. I was trained to survive anything except being forgotten. It started gradually, as it often does. My children, people I had once held in my arms through sickness and heartbreak, began to look at me differently. I saw it in their eyes, the fear, the discomfort. They whispered words like PTSD behind closed doors. They told neighbors I was unstable. Eventually, they labeled me crazy. It didn't happen overnight, but it felt that way. The day they told me to leave my own house was the day I learned that even blood could run cold. I didn't fight back. I don't know why. Maybe because after everything I had seen, the thought of losing my family, of confirming their worst fears, was the one thing I didn't know how to fight. I left with what little dignity I had left. I thought it would be temporary, a misunderstanding, a cooling-off period. But as days turned to weeks and weeks to months, no one came looking. I drifted from town to town, living in shadows, wearing the same coat that had once shielded me from desert winds, but now barely kept out the cold. Then came the moment I still can't fully believe happened. I was standing near the back of a local food bank, in a town whose name I can barely remember. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly feel my fingers. I hadn't eaten in nearly 3 days. A little girl I never learned her name saw me. She smiled. She held out a simple sandwich wrapped in wax paper. In that moment, I felt more seen than I had in years. But her parents saw something different. They saw a threat, a thief. I tried to explain. I didn't even have the strength to argue. But by then, someone had already called the police. The officer's hand on my shoulder felt heavier than any burden I had ever carried. And that's how I, Francesca Hale, Commander, United States Marine Corps, found myself handcuffed on a sidewalk for the first time in my life. Over a sandwich I never stole. They threw me out. They called me useless, crazy, dangerous. And then they accused me of stealing a sandwich. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into my wrists as they led me away. I don't remember looking at the crowd, but I remember the sound quiet, almost satisfied. The way people looked through me as if I had always been invisible. They booked me that night on petty theft charges. I sat in a holding cell, too exhausted to cry, too numb to feel anger. I had survived mortar fire ambushes and losing half my unit, but I don't think I was prepared for the quiet violence of being erased. The next morning, they brought me to court. I didn't expect anyone to be there for me. And no one was. My children, my own flesh and blood, weren't there. The gallery was filled with strangers who barely looked up from their phones. I stood alone at the defendant's table, the only sound the whisper of my worn boots against the floor. The prosecutor read my charges like I was nothing more than another case file to get through before lunch. He called me transient. He used words like history of instability. I kept my head down until something happened that I can't explain. The judge. He stopped mid-sentence. He frowned. He adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. And then he saw it. Around my neck, half hidden beneath the collar of my coat, was my old dog tag. He asked my name again. Slowly, carefully. I gave it, Francesca Hale. The judge went still. The room shifted. I recognized him before he said a word. Decades ago, I had pulled him, then a medic, barely 25, out of the burning wreckage of a convoy ambush in Fallujah. I saved his life. Now he was the one holding mine in his hands. He cleared his throat. His voice softened but stayed steady. This court, he said, recognizes the defendant as Commander Francesca Hale, United States Marine Corps, retired, decorated with distinction. We are transferring this case to the Veterans Court for proper evaluation and support. He paused, and then he stood up, looked me in the eye, and whispered a single word, Commander. The room froze. No one spoke. No one moved. In that moment, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't discarded. I was seen. And though I didn't know it yet, that moment, just that one small word, would change everything. I wasn't always this way. Long before the handcuffs, before the accusations, before the hunger and the silence, I was someone people respected. I was someone I respected. I joined the United States Marine Corps when I was 22, not because anyone pushed me into it. I chose it. I wanted to serve. I wanted to belong to something bigger than myself, something with purpose. From the first day of boot camp, I knew it was where I belonged. The discipline, the rigor, the clarity. When you're in uniform, things make sense in a way civilian life never does. There are rules, there is order. And for someone like me, someone who had always felt like an outsider, that order was everything. I wasn't the strongest, I wasn't the fastest, but I was determined. I learned to lead not because I wanted to be in front, but because I couldn't stand watching others fall behind. Over the years, I rose through the ranks. I took every deployment they gave me: desert storms, jungle mud, cities where the air smelled of burning rubber and fear. I saw things that carved deep lines into my soul, things I still see when I close my eyes. I learned early that not all battles are waged with guns. Some are waged with choices, with the weight of a single decision that could save a squad but cost you everything inside. I remember one mission like it happened yesterday. We were deep in hostile territory, Fallujah, the kind of place where the air itself hums with danger. The convoy ahead of us hit an IED. The blast lit up the sky like a second sun. Without thinking, I ran toward the flames. I found him, the medic, pinned under twisted metal. Half his face burned, his eyes wide with terror. Bullets cracked overhead, dirt exploded around us, but I didn't stop. I pulled him free, dragged him behind the smoldering remains of a Humvee. He was heavier than I expected, and my hands bled from the metal shards, but I didn't stop. Later, they called me a hero. They gave me a medal. But I don't remember the ceremony. I only remember his eyes. The way he whispered thank you like it was the last thing he'd ever say. Not everyone I pulled out made it. There were nights when I sat alone in the dark, writing letters to mothers and fathers' wives and husbands, telling them their sons and daughters wouldn't be coming home. I still see their faces, faces of those I couldn't save. And yet every time they asked me to go back, I went. Not because I craved danger, but because I believed in the mission. I believed that what we were doing mattered. Years turned into decades. The promotions came, the medals came, the injuries came. My knees have never fully healed from a fall during a night op in Kandahar. My right shoulder clicks when I move it too fast, a souvenir from shrapnel that tore through the Humvee's door. But I kept going, because it was my life, my identity, my purpose. And then one day it was over. No more orders, no more deployments, no more uniform. I thought I was ready. I wasn't. I came home to a world that didn't understand me, to children who no longer recognized the woman who had left them years before, to a quiet so loud it pressed against my skull until I couldn't breathe. I tried. God, I tried to fit back in. I planted a garden. I volunteered at the local shelter. I smiled when I didn't feel like smiling. But inside, I was still in uniform, still hearing the echoes of mortar shells in my sleep, still looking over my shoulder for enemies that weren't there. My children, they meant well at first. They said they were worried, that I seemed distant, paranoid. They used words like unstable in hushed tones. Then came the doctor visits, the evaluations, the whispered conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. Until one day they sat me down, both of them, and told me that for my own good, I needed to leave the house. They had already filed the paperwork. They said they'd help me get back on my feet somewhere else. I looked at their faces, the same faces I had kissed goodnight before every deployment, and I saw strangers. I packed a single bag. I walked out the front door, and I never went back. That was the day I stopped being Commander Francesca Hale. That was the day I became no one. When I first came home, I thought I would finally find peace. I believed that the hardest days were behind me, that somehow the uniform I took off would stay folded neatly in the past, along with the nightmares and the weight of all those years. I was wrong. The home I returned to wasn't the same one I had left. My children, grown now, were polite at first, cautious. There were awkward dinners filled with forced smiles, conversations that felt like rehearsed lines in a play none of us wanted to perform. I could see it in their eyes, though. The way they flinched when I dropped a glass. The way they tensed when a car backfired down the street and I froze mid-sentence. They didn't understand, and they didn't want to. It started with whispers, small hushed concerns between them when they thought I wasn't listening. Words like different and unwell floated through the air like poison. I tried harder, I really did. I took up gardening in the backyard. I baked. I joined a local community group. I kept busy thinking that maybe if I could just prove that I was normal, prove that I belonged, they would stop looking at me like I was broken. But no matter what I did, the distance between us grew. One night I overheard them talking in the kitchen. My son said he was worried I might hurt myself, or worse, someone else. My daughter agreed, her voice barely more than a whisper, trembling with fear that didn't belong. I felt like a ghost in my own home. Then came the papers. They sat me down at the dining room table, the same table where we had once celebrated birthdays and Christmases, and handed me documents that would strip me of everything. They told me it was temporary, that they were just trying to help, that I needed time and space to heal. They used words like mental fitness and protective guardianship, legal phrases that sounded clinical and sterile but cut deeper than any wound I had ever suffered on the battlefield. They told me I had to leave. I don't remember what I said. I don't even remember standing up. I just remember the way the walls felt closer, the way the air felt thin, and the way their eyes never met mine. I packed what I could carry into an old duffel bag, one that had followed me through more countries than I could count. A few clothes, my military ribbons, the dog tags I still wore around my neck out of habit more than pride, and I left. No one stopped me, no one looked back. The first night on the street was colder than any desert night I'd ever known. I found an alley behind a church and sat with my back against the brick's knees pulled to my chest, listening to the quiet hum of a world that no longer had a place for me. The second night was worse. Hunger gnawed at me, sharp and unforgiving. I thought about the MREs I used to complain about, the hot meals in dusty tents, the hands that passed bread and soup without question. By the third night, something inside me began to fade. Not physically, I've endured worse, but something deeper, something I didn't have words for. I became invisible. People passed me without seeing. Shopkeepers glanced away. Even the few who offered spare change did so with eyes that never met mine. The only thing that kept me tethered to this world was the weight of the dog tags around my neck. Every time I touched them, I remembered who I had been. Commander Francesca Hale. Not a thief, not a beggar, not whatever I had become. But names I learned don't mean much when you're living in shadows. I scavenged for food, collected cans for pennies, and slept wherever I could without being chased off. I lost track of time, days blurred into weeks. My reflection in storefront windows showed me a stranger. Hollow eyes, sunken cheeks, hair that no longer carried the sharpness of regulation cuts, but hung lifeless around my face. I told myself it was temporary, that anything would change. But deep down, I think I knew. No one was coming for me. And that's when I stopped waiting. That's when I became the ghost they had always feared I'd become. Living on the streets strips away everything you once thought made you human. The cold gets inside your bones first. It seeps in quietly like smoke under a door, until even your thoughts feel frozen. The hunger comes next. It's not just the gnawing in your stomach, it's the way your mind starts to shrink down to one single focused survival. Every morning, I woke up with my back pressed against concrete or brick. My first thought was always the same. Where can I find food? Where can I find warmth? People passed by without looking. Some glanced, then looked away quickly, embarrassed by the sight of me. Others most acted like I wasn't there at all. I had become invisible. A living ghost, haunting the edges of their comfortable lives. The places I thought might offer help didn't. Stores threatened to call the police if I lingered too long near their doors. Parks where I tried to sleep were patrolled by officers who told me to move along even when I had nowhere to go. The worst part wasn't the cold or the hunger, it was the humiliation. The slow, grinding erosion of dignity. I had commanded troops in foreign lands, led men and women through battles most of these people couldn't even imagine. And now I was huddled behind dumpsters, digging through garbage for half-eaten sandwiches. I learned the rhythms of the streets quickly. Which shelters filled up by dusk? Which alleys stayed the quietest? Which church kitchens might spare a bowl of soup if I waited long enough? There were moments of kindness, small, fleeting acts. A woman who pressed $1 into my hand without meeting my eyes. A teenager who left a scarf on a bench where I sat pretending not to notice me. They were rare, but they mattered. They reminded me I hadn't fully disappeared. Not yet. At night, when the wind cut sharper and the world grew quieter, my mind drifted back to memories I couldn't control. I saw my husband's face more often then. He died 15 years ago. Cancer. Quick. Brutal. I was deployed when the diagnosis came. I barely made it back in time to say goodbye. His voice was the last tether to a life that made sense. Even now I sometimes hear him in the wind calling my name, telling me to keep going. I thought of the desert too. The smell of gunpowder and diesel. The metallic taste of adrenaline when mortar rounds screamed overhead. I would wake in the middle of the night out there in the cold, my heart pounding, sure that I was back in Kandahar or Fallujah. It took me minutes sometimes to realize I wasn't in combat. I was just another broken soul sleeping in an alleyway. I hated myself for it. For the way my hands shook. For the way every sudden noise made me flinch. For the way I jumped at shadows. But more than that, I hated how easy it had been for the world to forget me. I wasn't looking for pity. I wasn't looking for handouts. I just wanted to exist without being treated like trash. There's a kind of violence that doesn't come from weapons or fists. It comes from indifference. From the way people refuse to meet your eyes. From the way they make you feel less than human without ever saying a word. I kept moving, day after day, place after place. My body ached constantly. My clothes hung looser with each passing week. The coat I wore, once sharp and precise in military green, had frayed at every edge. Sometimes, when I found a spot quiet enough, I would pull out my husband's photograph. The edges were worn soft from years of handling. His smile, frozen in time, reminded me of who I used to be, who I still was underneath the dirt and exhaustion. I whispered to him sometimes, silly things, bits of old conversations. I told him I missed him. I told him I was trying. I held on to those whispers because no one else was speaking to me. There were moments I thought about giving up, letting the cold take me, slipping away quietly, just another nameless face, lost to the night. But then I would remember something he once told me during the early years, when deployments stretched long and loneliness felt suffocating. He said, you don't leave your post until someone comes to relieve you. And if no one comes, you hold the line anyway. So I held the line, even when no one saw me, even when no one cared. I held on, because that's what Marines do. It happened on a cold afternoon I can still feel in my bones, the kind of cold that sinks beneath your skin and makes you feel brittle from the inside out. I hadn't eaten properly in days. My body was weak, trembling so badly I could barely keep my hands steady. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, barely capable of holding me upright. I wandered toward the back entrance of a small food bank. It wasn't much, just a modest brick building with chipped paint and a crooked sign, but from where I stood it looked like salvation. I didn't plan to take anything. That's the part people never understand. Hunger doesn't erase your sense of right and wrong. It just makes the world smaller, narrower. I lingered near the side wall, hoping for leftovers, for scraps, anything to quiet the sharp, hollow ache that had become my constant companion. That's when I saw her. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8, with dark hair pulled back in a messy braid. She was standing near the food line, holding a sandwich wrapped in crinkled wax paper. She looked at me the way no one else did, not with fear, not with pity, but with something that felt dangerously close to kindness. Without a word, she walked over and held the sandwich out to me. I remember hesitating. For a moment, pride tried to wrestle with desperation, but the hunger won. My hands shook as I reached for it. The bread was still warm through the paper, the weight of it almost too much for my fingers to manage. I barely whispered, "Thank you," though I doubt she even heard me. That's when everything shifted. Her mother's voice cut through the air like a blade, sharp, loud, accusatory. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" The woman rushed over, yanking the girl back by the arm, her eyes wide with disgust as they landed on me. "She stole that," she spat, her voice rising higher. "Call the police," I tried to explain. The words caught somewhere between my throat and my heart. I shook my head, holding the sandwich out to return it. But she was already screaming. People were already turning. Eyes. Everywhere there were eyes. Cold, judgmental. I became aware of the way I looked, the filthy coat, the tangled hair, the cracked lips. To them, I wasn't someone who had served their country. I wasn't a mother. I wasn't even human. I was a threat. The accusations spread like wildfire. Words blurred together. Thief, dangerous, crazy. The little girl stood frozen, her eyes wide and confused as more people gathered, murmuring, pointing, pulling out phones but doing nothing to help. I stood there, the sandwich still in my shaking hands, until the sound of sirens cut through the murmurs. 2 officers arrived. 1 male, 1 female. The male barely glanced at me before moving to restrain me. The woman, the younger of the 2, hesitated when her eyes caught the glint of the dog tag that hung around my neck. "You served?" she asked softly, almost under her breath. I nodded. Just once. A tiny movement. "A long time ago," I managed to say. But it didn't matter. Procedure was procedure. The handcuffs snapped cold around my wrists. The sandwich tumbled from my fingers and hit the pavement. I didn't resist. Not because I was guilty, but because by then I no longer knew how to fight for myself. As they led me away, the crowd watched in silence, some with curiosity, some with contempt. Not one of them spoke up. Not one stepped forward. It was the kind of silence that screamed louder than any accusation. The female officer glanced at me again as we reached the squad car. I saw something shift in her expression, a flicker of doubt, maybe, or discomfort. But she said nothing. The door closed behind me. The cold metal pressed against my back. And just like that, whatever pieces of me were left shattered. I wasn't Francesca Hale, the commander. I wasn't a mother. I wasn't anyone. I was just another invisible face in a world that no longer cared. The courtroom smelled of dust and disinfectant. I remember that most of all. The lights overhead flickered slightly, casting a pale, sickly glow over the scratched wood benches and faded walls. I stood alone at the defendant's table, hands still trembling, though they were no longer bound. My coat hung loose around my shoulders, stiff with cold and dampness from the night before. Every movement felt heavy, every breath tasted stale. No one looked at me, not really. The prosecutor, a young man barely older than some of the recruits I once trained, didn't bother to meet my eyes as he flipped through a thin file of paperwork. His voice was flat, mechanical, as he read the charges into the record. The defendant, Francesca Hale, was apprehended for the theft of property, specifically food items, from a local community resource center. Given her transient status, lack of employment, and prior citations for loitering, the state recommends remand pending further evaluation. His words cut through the air, sharp and impersonal. He didn't see me. He saw a case number. Another problem to shuffle along the system until it disappeared. I glanced toward the rows of wooden benches behind me. A handful of spectators, none of whom I knew, sat scattered in uneasy silence. No familiar faces, no family. Not that I expected anyone to be there. My children had made it clear I was no longer their concern. My public defender sat beside me, a tired-looking woman with dark circles under her eyes, her clothes slightly rumpled. She didn't speak to me when I arrived. She barely spoke now. Her eyes stayed fixed on the paperwork, her lips pressed into a tight line. I understood. I wasn't her priority. I wasn't anyone's priority. The judge, a tall man with silver hair and glasses perched low on his nose, cleared his throat as he adjusted his seat. His expression was blank, unreadable, the kind of face that had seen too many cases like mine to register anything beyond boredom. As the charges were read, I felt my heart pounding, not from fear, but from something deeper. A kind of hollow grief I couldn't name. I stood there still and silent, as though I were observing my own life from the outside, as though none of this were truly happening. My eyes drifted. Somewhere beyond the courtroom walls, I could still hear echoes of commands barked across sand dunes, the metallic scent of burning oil and blood in the air. I could still feel the weight of the rifle in my hands, the heat of Kevlar pressing into my shoulders, the earth trembling beneath my boots as mortars rained down. I blinked. For a moment, I wasn't in a courtroom. I was back in Fallujah. The sound of the gavel snapped me back. The prosecutor continued speaking, droning on about criminal trespass and community safety concerns. His words blurred. I saw something else instead. I saw the face of a young medic, his uniform torn, blood pouring from his leg, trapped beneath twisted metal as smoke billowed into the sky. I remembered the way he looked at me, his eyes wide with terror as I pulled him free. the shrapnel tearing at my hands, the heat of the flames licking at my skin. I had carried him step by agonizing step until we both collapsed behind the charred remains of a transport vehicle. I remember whispering to him to hold on, that help was coming, that he wasn't alone. For that one moment in my life, I wasn't just a soldier, I was hope. The memory faded, replaced once again by the sterile walls of the courtroom. I felt the weight of my dog tag beneath my coat cool against my skin, the edges worn smooth from years of wear. I wondered if anyone here would ever know who I had been. If anyone would care. The young prosecutor wrapped up his statement recommending pretrial detention due to the unpredictable nature of my behavior. He never once looked at me. My public defender stood only because she had to. She mumbled something about my military service, about possible trauma, about the need for compassion. But even her words felt half-hearted, as though she too had already given up. The judge nodded, made a few marks on his papers, then lifted his gaze. For the first time since I entered the room, his eyes met mine. And something, just the faintest flicker, crossed his face. Recognition. It lasted less than a heartbeat, but I saw it. I held my breath, waiting, but then he looked away, adjusted his glasses, and called for a brief recess. The bailiff led me back toward the holding area. My knees felt unsteady beneath me, but I kept my head high. I didn't know it yet, but that flicker in the judge's eyes would change everything. When the recess was called, I was led back to a narrow hallway behind the courtroom. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting everything in a sterile, washed-out glow. I sat on a cold metal bench, my hands folded in my lap, trying to keep my breathing steady. I could still feel the weight of the judge's eyes on me, the briefest flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Recognition, memory. It had been so quick I wondered if I imagined it. The minutes dragged. My public defender didn't speak, neither did I. The silence pressed down harder than any courtroom judgment. When the bailiff finally called us back, and my legs felt heavy, but I forced them to move. One step, then another. I returned to my place at the defendant's table, my heart pounding in my chest as if some distant part of me knew the ground was about to shift. The judge sat differently when we re-entered. His expression was no longer distant, no longer blank. His eyes held something, hesitation perhaps, or the weight of a memory that refused to fade. He cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses again. I watched every small movement with the hyper-awareness I had learned on the battlefield. Every twitch, every breath, every flicker of emotion. When he spoke, his voice was lower, measured, almost careful. Before this court proceeds, he began, his eyes flicking toward the file in front of him, I would like to address the matter of the defendant's identity and service record. A ripple of murmurs moved through the gallery, but I barely heard them. My heart thundered louder than their voices. The judge continued, his words deliberate. Francesca Hale, he said slowly, is a retired commander of the United States Marine Corps. Her service record reflects over 2 decades of active duty, multiple commendations for valor, and battlefield injuries sustained in combat zones. His voice caught slightly, just for a fraction of a second, before he pushed on. In light of these facts, and given the unique challenges faced by veterans, particularly those experiencing homelessness or untreated trauma, this case will be transferred immediately to Veterans Court for proper evaluation and consideration. I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. No one in the room spoke. The prosecutor shifted awkwardly in his seat, his earlier confidence draining from his face. My public defender straightened, blinking in confusion. The judge's eyes returned to me, and then something extraordinary happened. He rose to his feet, slowly, deliberately. He adjusted his robe, cleared his throat once more, and then looked me directly in the eye. For the first time since I walked into that courtroom, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't an object to be processed. I was seen. The words he spoke next were soft, barely above a whisper, but somehow they carried through every corner of that silent room. "Welcome home, Commander." I felt my knees tremble. My hands clenched unconsciously around the frayed edges of my coat. No one applauded. No one cheered. There were no grand speeches, no sweeping music. Just silence. A silence that held the weight of everything that had been lost, and something, however fragile, that had been returned. The spectators, those who had moments ago whispered judgment, sat motionless. The prosecutor's mouth hung slightly open. My public defender exhaled sharply, her hands still resting on the unopened file. And me, I lowered my eyes for a moment, because if I hadn't, I think I might have cried. I thought about the countless times I had stood at attention in uniform, the ceremonies, the salutes, the medals, and none had ever felt like this moment. It wasn't the title, it wasn't the recognition, it was something deeper, something I hadn't even known I was starving for: dignity. For the first time in years, I stood taller. The judge's words still echoed in my mind as the bailiff gestured gently for me to follow. The case was no longer theirs to prosecute. The machinery of shame had been paused. No one said another word as I left the room. But in that silence, I felt something shift, not just in them, but in me. I wasn't erased, I wasn't forgotten. I was still here, and somehow against every odd, I was still standing. The courtroom doors closed behind me with a soft click, but the weight of what had just happened clung to me like a second skin. My footsteps echoed down the sterile hallway, each step slow, deliberate, as though my legs were moving through water. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The bailiff walked a few paces behind me, silent, respectful, in a way I hadn't expected. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed quietly, casting pale shadows on the scuffed linoleum floor. My eyes burned. Not from the harsh lighting, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something I had fought against for so long it felt foreign. I kept my head down, blinking hard, willing the sting in my eyes to fade. But the lump in my throat only grew heavier. No one spoke. No one reached out. The building itself seemed to hold its breath, as though the walls bore witness to something they couldn't quite name. I could still hear the judge's words, soft but sharp as any command I'd ever received in uniform. Welcome home, Commander. For a lifetime, I had learned how to bury emotion. On the battlefield, you didn't cry. You didn't shake. You survived. You carried others when they couldn't walk. You held your breath and moved forward. But this was different. This wasn't about medals or battles. This was about being seen again after so many years of being invisible. I reached up almost without thinking and touched the chain around my neck. The dog tag was cold beneath my fingers, the familiar metal smooth from decades of wear. I pressed my thumb against the stamped letters. My name, my blood type, my history, all still there, even when the world had tried to strip everything else away. When we reached the exit, the bailiff held the door open for me. He gave a small nod, nothing more, and I nodded back. The winter air outside hit me like a wave, sharp, clean, real. I exhaled slowly, the breath trembling as it left my lungs. For the first time in years, I allowed the tears to fall. Silent, unstoppable, and I kept walking, because even broken soldiers know how to march. I didn't expect anything to come from that day in court. After the hearing, I slipped back into the shadows the way I always had. I found a temporary bed at a veterans' shelter, somewhere small and quiet, the kind of place where no one asked too many questions. I thought it would all fade away, just another chapter of humiliation softened only by the kindness of a single man who happened to remember who I used to be. I was wrong. It started with a stranger, a young woman I barely noticed sitting quietly in the back row of the courtroom that day. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't scrolling through her phone or whispering behind cupped hands. She had been watching, really watching. Her name was Emily Carter. I didn't know it then, but she was a freelance journalist, small town, barely published, always chasing stories no one else cared to tell. I heard her name for the first time when one of the shelter volunteers brought me an old crumpled newspaper a few days later. The headline stretched across the top in bold, heavy print, "The Invisible Commander, How We Forgot One of Our Own." I sat on the edge of my cot, the paper shaking in my hands as I read each word, slowly, carefully. She told the whole story, not just the sandwich, not just the courtroom. She dug deeper. Somehow, through old military records, dusty medal lists, scattered interviews, she pieced together the person I had once been. She wrote about my service, about the lives I had helped save, about the sacrifices no one ever bothered to see. But more than that, she wrote about what happened after, about how easy it is for a nation to cheer you when you wear the uniform, and how much easier it is for that same nation to forget you once the uniform comes off. She called me the Invisible Commander, a name that felt so painfully true it made my chest tighten. I didn't know how to react. I sat frozen for what felt like hours, my fingers tracing the grainy black and white photograph. She somehow unearthed an image of me in full dress blues, years and lifetimes ago. The article spread faster than I could have imagined. First, it made the rounds through local online groups. Then it reached veteran forums, places I hadn't even known existed, digital campfires, where old soldiers shared war stories and quiet battles. From there, it spiraled outward, regional papers, national outlets, television, radio. Within days, strangers were reaching out to the shelter. Cards arrived, letters, a handful of donated supplies. But what struck me most wasn't the attention. It was the words they used. They called me a hero. They called me brave. They called me forgotten. For so long, I had carried the weight of invisibility like a second skin. I had convinced myself that I didn't matter, that my story had ended the moment I was cast aside. But now, against every expectation, people were listening. The article didn't magically fix everything. It didn't erase the nights I spent shivering on frozen sidewalks, or the faces of those who had turned away. But it did something I never thought possible. It gave me back my voice. And that, more than anything, was enough to begin again. The days that followed were unlike anything I had known before. I wasn't prepared for the reaction. People who had once crossed the street to avoid me now averted their eyes for a different reason. Not out of disgust or fear, but out of shame. The same faces that had glared at me as I huddled near storefronts now lowered their gazes when I passed. There were no words, just silence. Heavy, uncomfortable, telling silence. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was unforgettable in the worst way for them. The article kept spreading. Strangers from towns I'd never heard of sent letters to the shelter. Some shared their own stories of fathers, mothers, siblings, who had served only to come home to closed doors and cold shoulders. The words, "thank you," appeared over and over. 2 words I hadn't heard in years. But the ones who moved me most weren't the journalists or the people online. It was the veterans. One by one they came. First, it was an older man, Vietnam era, wearing a battered hat with faded pins. He didn't say much, just sat next to me on the shelter steps and handed me a cup of coffee. We drank in silence. It was enough. Then another, a woman from the Gulf War, walking with a cane, her hands shaking slightly as she introduced herself. And then more. Korean War vets, Iraq, Afghanistan, men and women of every color, every creed, every rank. Some in uniform, most not. They found me because they understood, because they had stood in the same shadows, because they knew that the battles didn't end when the uniforms came off. Together we sat. Sometimes we shared stories. Sometimes we just shared the silence. But in those moments, I felt something I thought I'd lost forever: belonging. It wasn't long before I saw familiar faces too. Faces I never thought I'd see again. My children. They didn't come all at once. It began with my son standing awkwardly outside the shelter one morning, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a boy again. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, hands shoved deep into his pockets, his eyes never quite meeting mine. Eventually, he offered a stilted greeting. A soft "hi, Mom," barely audible over the breeze. I nodded. I didn't have words either. A few days later, my daughter appeared. She looked older than I remembered, tired, ashamed. She held herself differently, like the weight of what they had done was finally pressing down in full. They didn't ask for forgiveness. They didn't offer excuses. They just showed up. And sometimes that's all there is to do when the damage is too deep for words. I let them stand there. I let them carry the silence the way I had carried it for so long. And still I stayed on my path. I wasn't angry, not in the way people expected. The hurt was still there, buried deep, but I was learning to carry it differently. What mattered now wasn't revenge or retribution. What mattered was that I was no longer alone. The ripples of one story, just one, had cracked the ice that had once sealed me out. The world hadn't fully changed. It never would. But something inside me had shifted, and that was enough to keep moving forward. I never imagined I'd stand in front of that house again. The house I once called home. The house where I raised my children. Where I built a life with my husband before the deployments, before the medals, before everything unraveled. It looked smaller than I remembered. The paint had begun to fade, the front steps slightly warped from rain and years of wear. The wind moved through the trees with the same soft sigh it always had, but the place itself felt distant, foreign. They were waiting for me on the porch, my son, my daughter, both standing stiffly side by side like children called before a principal, unsure, uncomfortable, carrying the weight of their own silence. They didn't wave, they didn't smile. They just stood there watching as I stepped from the cab and gathered what little I had left. I didn't meet their eyes. I couldn't. The memories flooded me in waves. Christmas lights along the railing, chalk drawings on the driveway. The echo of my husband's laughter carried through the open windows. It felt like another lifetime, a life that belonged to someone else. I made my way up the walkway, slowly, my knees aching with every step, my breath clouding in the cold air. I held the straps of my worn duffel tighter, my fingers numb despite the gloves. They said nothing, not a word. I felt their eyes, though. Watched them shift, falter lower to the ground. There was shame there, not the performative kind, but something deeper, something that clung to their skin the way humiliation had once clung to mine. When I reached the front door, my daughter stepped aside. She fumbled with her hands, but said nothing. My son kept his eyes down, jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle flicker along his cheek. No apologies, no explanations, just the unbearable weight of shared history, too broken to name. I let them hold the silence. I had carried it long enough. The door was unlocked. I placed my hand on the knob and hesitated. My fingers trembled. It wasn't just the cold, it was the memories pressed into every corner of that house. The echoes of who I was, who I had lost, who they had let me become. I stood there for a long moment, my breath shallow, my heart rattling somewhere beneath the bruised bones of my chest. And then I turned the knob. The door creaked softly as it opened, revealing the familiar warmth of the living room beyond. The couch, the photos, the worn carpet, everything the same, yet nothing the same. I stepped inside without looking back. They didn't follow right away. They stayed on the porch, their silhouettes framed by the failing light, two figures caught between guilt and distance. I didn't know what this meant. I didn't know if it was a beginning or just another ending. I only knew that I wasn't the one who had to speak first. The air inside smelled faintly of pine cleaner and something sweeter, maybe cookies or candles. And for a second I thought about how strange it was that homes can remember what people forget. I set my bag down slowly. My hands were still shaking. I flexed my fingers, willing the sensation back into them. The quiet pressed in on all sides. I knew somewhere in the depths of my mind that people were watching. The story had spread too far too fast. There would be whispers, online forums, debates, strangers arguing over whether I should forgive, whether I should stay. Some would say family is family no matter the hurt. Others would say some wounds can't be undone. I didn't know where I stood. Not yet. All I knew was that the door had opened, that they had let me in, that for now that was enough. I sat down on the old couch, my hands resting in my lap. I stared straight ahead. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just sat. And for the first time in a very long time, I breathed. The changes didn't happen overnight. They came slowly, quietly, like the first stirrings of dawn before the sun breaks the horizon. At first, it was the way people looked at me, or rather, the way they couldn't. Strangers in town, faces that once sneered or avoided me altogether, now met my eyes only long enough to glance away in shame. I wasn't sure if it was guilt or pity, but for the first time in years, I wasn't invisible. When I walked down the sidewalk, people moved aside. Some nodded politely, a few murmured greetings. I even caught one man, someone who'd once chased me off his property tip, his head slightly in what could only be described as respect. It felt strange, uneasy, as though I had stepped into a version of my life that didn't quite belong to me. The letters started arriving next. Some came from veterans, men and women I had never met but who somehow knew me now, who called me sister or hero or simply one of us. They shared pieces of their own stories, years of service, invisible wounds, families that didn't understand. Their words weren't always neat or eloquent, but they carried something heavier than metal's truth. Others came from civilians, strangers, whose names meant nothing to me but whose words caught somewhere deep in my chest. Some apologized for walking past me. Some admitted they never realized how easily society could discard its own. But the letter that struck me most came in a plain white envelope with no return address. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged in places, but the words were careful. It was from a woman who admitted without flourish or excuse that she had once been one of the people who looked at me with disgust. She remembered seeing me outside the food bank. She remembered crossing the street to avoid me. She wrote that the article the story had forced her to look at herself in a way she hadn't expected. She ended the letter simply, "I am sorry, I was wrong." I read that letter twice, then a third time. I folded it carefully and tucked it into my pocket. Something in me shifted after that. I could have chosen to walk away from it all, to slip back into the quiet, to rebuild alone. But there was something I couldn't shake, the thought that there were others still out there. Others like me, forgotten, dismissed, silenced. So when the director of a national veterans outreach program contacted me, offering not charity, not pity, but purpose, I said yes. Not because I wanted recognition, not because I needed redemption, but because somewhere along the way I had remembered who I was, who I still could be. I agreed to speak, to share my story, not just as a cautionary tale, but as proof that even the forgotten can find their voice again. The first time I stood in front of a group half veterans, half community leaders, I felt my hands tremble the way they once had in the courtroom. But I spoke anyway. I told them the truth. The good, the bad, the unbearable. I told them about the cold nights and the quiet, about the betrayal, about the small moments of kindness that saved me when nothing else could. And when I finished, they stood, not in applause, but in stillness, in respect. I wasn't broken, not anymore. I was home. I never thought I would stand on a stage again. Not for medals, not for ceremony. But there I was under the soft glow of late afternoon light. The colors of the town square faded but warm, the smell of autumn leaves heavy in the air, surrounded by faces I once believed would never see me. The local council had called it a recognition of service, but I knew what it really was: a quiet apology. An unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had been taken from me, of everything I had lost, and somehow, against all odds, reclaimed. I stood at the center of a modest wooden stage set up near the courthouse steps. Rows of folding chairs stretched out before me, filled with neighbors, strangers, veterans, children. Faces that blurred together, faces I had once feared, but now met without flinching. In the front row sat the judge, the same man who had first spoken the word "commander" in that cold courtroom weeks before. Beside him were local officials, volunteers from the shelter, and members of the veterans group that had welcomed me back into the world. I wore a new coat, simple, dark, clean. The weight of it across my shoulders felt grounding, steady. Around my neck, beneath the fabric, my dog tags rested, cool metal, pressed to my skin, a familiar comfort. They called my name. Commander Francesca Hale. I stepped forward slowly, hands steady, chin lifted. I didn't need a speech. I didn't need rehearsed words. Instead, I let the moment breathe. And then I saw them off to the side of the stage, a small group of young service members in uniform. Their faces young, their eyes bright with the kind of reverence I remembered from my first deployments. One by one, they raised their hands in sharp, precise salutes. I felt something break and rebuild inside me all at once. I returned the salute, slow, deliberate. My palm hovered at my brow, my fingers steady. The crowd rose to their feet. Not loud, not theatrical. Just quiet respect, dozens of people standing together. Their heads bowed slightly, their hands pressed to their hearts. No one spoke. No one needed to. For the first time in years, I wasn't just a woman who had been discarded. I was seen. I was honored. And I was home. That night, back in the small room the Veterans Organization had offered me, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. The overhead light buzzed faintly, casting soft reflections along the edges of the worn glass. I barely recognized the face staring back. The lines were deeper now, the silver in my hair brighter, the shadows beneath my eyes darker. But there was something steadier too, something I hadn't seen in a long time. I lifted my hands and smoothed the fabric of the new coat along my shoulders. It wasn't military issue. There were no insignias, no patches, but it felt like armor just the same. I reached beneath the collar and pulled out the chain I had worn through every deployment, every storm, every moment of collapse. The dog tags glinted softly under the light. My fingertips traced the letters by heart. Hale Francesca J. USMC. The metal was worn, dulled by time and sweat and memory, but the name was still there, still mine. I let out a slow breath. For so long I had believed I was lost, not just to the world but to myself. The version of me that had stood tall in uniform, that had led troops, that had crossed oceans for something bigger than herself, I thought she was gone. But she wasn't. She had been buried beneath the weight of betrayal, beneath the silence of the streets, beneath the hunger and the cold. But she had never truly left. I turned slightly, studying my reflection, watching the way the coat settled over my frame, the way the tags caught the light. I thought about my husband, his laughter, his hand in mine on the front porch of the house we built together. I thought about the faces of soldiers I had led, the letters I had written home for those who never made it back. I thought about the courtroom, the judge, the child with the sandwich, the quiet that followed every act of cruelty and every act of grace. And then I smiled. Just slightly. I wasn't the same. I would never be the same. But that didn't mean I was broken. I pressed the tags back beneath the collar, straightened my shoulders, and exhaled. I am Francesca Hale. I survived. I returned. And I am still standing. Some nights when the world grows quiet, I still hear his voice. My husband's laughter, soft, low, the kind that filled rooms without effort, lingers in my memory in a way nothing else does. There are moments in the stillness when I can almost feel his hand in mine, again, the weight of it steadying me the way it always did. He never served in uniform, but he served in the quiet ways that matter most, wading through endless deployments, writing letters I read by flashlight in distant deserts, holding our family together every time I was called away. I remember the last thing he told me before the cancer took him, his voice a whisper so soft I had to lean in to catch it. "We don't fight to be remembered," he said. "We fight so that no one has to be forgotten." I've carried those words with me through every battle since. Not just the ones on foreign soil, but the ones here on sidewalks, in shelters, in courtrooms. The battles no one pins medals for. I think about the friend I lost in Kandahar, the young recruit who never made it home, the medic I pulled from burning metal, who still sends me Christmas cards every year. I think about the faces of the men and women who sat beside me on park benches and shelter steps, invisible to the world, but still carrying stories, still carrying themselves with quiet dignity. I used to believe survival was enough. That breathing, moving, enduring, that was the whole point. But I see it differently now. Survival matters, but so does memory, so does connection. So does the small, fierce choice to stand for others when no one else will. We don't fight to be honored. We fight to ensure no one is left behind. That's the lesson I will carry with me until the very end. And it's the lesson I now pass on. The first time I stood in front of the new group, I could feel the old nerves rise. It wasn't a battlefield. It wasn't a courtroom. But in some ways, it felt heavier. I stood on the edge of a small clearing, a dozen faces watching me, some young, some weathered by years, all marked by the quiet, familiar weight of what they carried inside. Veterans, survivors, people the world had pushed to the margins, but who still stood. I didn't give a speech. I didn't tell them what to feel. Instead, I told the truth. I told them about the cold, the hunger, the silence, the small kindnesses that saved me when the world turned its back. And I told them about the moment I stood alone in a courtroom and heard a word I thought I'd lost forever: commander. Their eyes never left mine. Some nodded, some wiped their eyes, some stood straighter. When I finished, I stepped down and joined them, not above, not apart, but among. We walked together that day, down quiet streets, past places where I had once been invisible. And as we moved, people noticed. Some lowered their eyes. Others stood and watched in stillness. A few hesitantly raised their hands in small gestures of respect. I led the way, my steps steady, my gaze forward. Around my neck, beneath the new coat, the dog tags pressed lightly against my heart. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was pretending to be whole. I was whole. I was Francesca Hale. Not what I had lost, not what had been taken, but what I had chosen to reclaim. I'm still standing. I'm still here. And I have returned not for applause, not for pity, but to remind others that sometimes the fight is not for medals, but for the quiet dignity of being seen. And today, I see them. All of them. Before we say goodbye, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let me know in the comments. I read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you and remember sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and I'll see you in the next story.